kind of with this question of, easier and future versus past, I'm kind of really now looking into the future. So I'm potentially thinking about how we can make it easier. So how can we strengthen wilderness fire management going forward? And like Vita said, this is a work in progress. And so I am going to end with recommendations today. But I've talked to a lot. I've done a lot of interviews, but I'd love to get more feedback as the day goes on. So a little bit of background on this project. It actually started, the question was more related to, what have we learned from wilderness fire management in the Northern Rockies? And then as I was doing these interviews, and I was talking to these managers, both current and past managers who were so committed to wilderness fire, it became pretty clear that there was a lot of concern that maybe the program was losing steam. And so as interviews went forward and I did more interviews, I started asking those managers, well, how do you think then we could strengthen it? How could we potentially reverse that trend of losing steam? And so that's kind of what I'm presenting on today, this question that kind of was born out of the interviews themselves. And I do, because it started off with these ideas of lessons learned, I do want to touch upon them today, because I think it's really important to think about what we've learned from wilderness fire if we then want to justify strengthening the wilderness fire program going forward. And a lot of these have already been touched upon already. Feels a little silly to say it in a conference or in a workshop dedicated to wilderness fire.
Sorry, that was in.
But obviously, wilderness fire is important. It's important ecologically in that it restores those landscape mosaics and heterogeneity, which then feeds into more foraging habitat for big game. It also can increase our soil water holding capacity. And then it can provide that reference point. So what's happening inside the wilderness as a reference point for what we want to manage to outside wilderness areas. But also it's important in terms of guiding management. So I think it's important to remember that, in 1972, when the Whitecap study was going online, that was a heretical idea. And I know we've touched upon that already, but it was those large wilderness areas that really made reintroduction of fire into the landscape easier. And then by learning those skills, so learning about long-term fire management strategies, those skills could then be used outside the wilderness as well. So it really changed how we thought about fire from full suppression 100% of the time to managing fire more. And like I said, it really went from just inside the wilderness to outside the wilderness. So what we were doing in areas like the Bob Marshall and Selway Bitterroot, we were gaining those long-term fire management skills. So that then in years like 2000, when the Bitterroot Valley is burning out of control, or a lot more fires are occurring in the Bitterroot Valley, and you no longer have the ability to suppress all those fires, skills that were learned inside wilderness areas are now being applied outside wilderness. Those fire managers have the ability to make that risk assessment of where it's safe to put firefighters, where maybe that's not a risk that's worth taking, and you can let fire potentially do good ecological work on the landscape, even outside the wilderness. Another lesson learned, which has been touched upon both by Carol and Vita, is this importance of personality. So having a manager on the ground who has a commitment to wilderness fire and commitment to the idea of wilderness in general is really important to a strong wilderness fire program. So there's really that strong idea of commitment to that, like untrammeled by man, letting natural processes play out. That is that language that's present in the Wilderness Act. Commitment to that then transfers over and allows for a stronger wilderness fire program. So given that wilderness fire has been so important and we've learned so much from wilderness fire, both for inside the wilderness and outside wilderness areas, it comes to this question of then, if we're worried about it potentially declining, how can we strengthen it going forward? How can we potentially reverse this trend? I think this quote from one of my interviews really well sums up the potential challenges to the program, in which I was asking all these questions, and then he returns with the question of, is this program, meaning the Wilderness Fire Program, is it by design or is it by chance? And in the process of this interview, he was kind of arguing that right now, because we're relying on that strong wilderness ethic of the individual managers on the ground, we're really leaving the program up to chance. So knowing that, how can we potentially make this program more by design? And a potential answer to that I'm kind of putting forward to today and would love to get some feedback on is that Leadership, so leadership at the national, regional level, needs to provide clear intent. They develop the sideboards and realize that there's no straight line down. So what does that potentially look like? Well, at the regional and national level, they need to provide and clearly state a framework for the program, and then continually support that framework and that program. And then those managers on the ground who are implementing that program need to have the workforce development and training so that they can work within that framework and carry it forward. So in other words, this is kind of a two-pronged approach, both top-down support from the regional and national office, and then bottom-up on the ground. So what kind of solutions could possibly lead to this? Well, at the regional and national level, there could be some potential policy changes. So it seems like right now, ever since 2009, this shift to more flexible management response, people are starting, there was a lot of friction at the beginning, but now the general consensus seems to be that policy is written fairly well to support wilderness fire. But there could be some changes like potential budget allocations. So one interview subject specifically said a lot of times the difficulty isn't managing the fire itself, but managing the fire effects. And we have money to manage the fire potentially, but then there's no money to manage for trails or campsite restoration afterwards. So if more money could potentially be reallocated for trail and campsite restoration, rather than just for fire effects as it's burning, it makes it a little bit easier for managers to allow the next fire, to say, okay, we're gonna allow the next fire to burn. And districts where where money has come in for trail restoration afterwards, like here, that's been the case. They have money for trail restoration afterwards. Also, this is talked about with Tanya, but this idea of fire management modules. So they've kind of lost steam. And that loss of teams specifically dedicated to managing long-term events has made it harder for us to allow for wilderness fire. Specifically, they hesitate to call in a type 1 or type 2 team without that specific training because they don't know if they'll really be able to then get a team that's able to carry out the plan that they kind of have in mind. This idea of career risk, so it's a lot, again, that dependence on a strong personality, not only committed to wilderness, but willingness to allow a fire to burn, potentially at the risk of their own career. That's a lot to ask, so if there's a way to lessen that career risk, you could really strengthen the wilderness fire program. And then we get back to this idea of incentives. So with that loss of the distinction between wildland fire use versus a suppression event, you lost the potential incentive of counting acres burned towards fuels management, which, it was mentioned that a lot of folks here in Region 1 relied on that incentive to make the case for their wilderness fire. So without that distinction, I understand that we can maybe no longer have that particular incentive. So what other potential incentives are there out there to incentivize managers to say, okay, we're gonna let this wilderness fire burn? Also at the regional and national level, more outreach and support for wilderness fire. So over and over in my interviews, I was hearing that at those top levels of leadership, there's often silence when a wilderness fire is actually burning, particularly if something goes poorly with that wilderness fire. So that really needs to change to reduce the friction, not only between the national and regional level and the folks managing the fire, but then also the folks managing the fire and the public overall, because they're getting the brunt of all that as it burns. Also better definition of goals for the wilderness fire program. So again, we're talking about a framework here. If we clearly define goals of what we want to achieve with the wilderness fire program, it gives managers on the ground something to work towards. This third point, emphasizing wilderness, is a little bit tricky. Right now, a lot of times when we talk about wilderness fire, we're really focusing on the fire. So we talk about, oh, this fire burns and it treats these acres, or it provides a barrier, or it increases forage habitat. But there is that other word in wilderness fire, wilderness itself. And if in the Wilderness Act we're saying we're managing for untrammeled by man, then that in itself gives justification for no suppression. So even though it's a little bit less tangible, so a little bit harder to communicate to the public, it does provide incentive in itself. And then there's that idea of public education. So how do we talk to the public? And it really needs, at the regional and national level, or especially at the national level, we were really successful with Smokey the Bear. So how do we now reharness that marketing technique? again, George Weldon calls this the best program that we ever had. And when I was talking to him, he pointed out to me, in terms of acres treated and cost per acre, this is the best program that the Forest Service manages, but we're not telling the public this. We're not communicating that to the public. And if we continue to go forward, how do we think about those talking points that allow us to communicate this idea to the public? So that was what we can potentially change at the top levels, but what can we potentially do on the ground to better strengthen the program? So this idea of wilderness ethic, this commitment to the language of the Wilderness Act, this commitment to wilderness fire, if it's so important for a wilderness fire program, then how can we potentially strengthen it? And when I asked my interview subjects, well, what gave you your wilderness ethic? What came up over and over again was mentorships or ecological training. So ecological training a lot was, college courses that then that gave those individuals a better understanding of the importance of fire in the Western landscape. So how can we potentially incorporate this at the local level, provide more training for firefighters who are working in a wilderness district? Also mentorships. So just having someone there to help a new manager understand the importance of wilderness fire and the wilderness ethic was said over and over again. George Weldon was there for me and he told me X, Y, and Z, and that really inspired me. Or just hearing Bud Moore really inspired me. So those mentorships can be really important. Also, long-term management skills on the forest. So beyond having teams available to come in, just having individuals on the district or forest themselves could potentially increase a forest's ability to manage a long-term event. So that can be like the fire behavior analysis or the strategic operation planner. So finding some way to incentivize those programs or those qualifications. But also a lot of this is really hard to learn in the classroom. You kind of have to go out and just do it. So that's again where mentorships can come in handy. If you're new to a district or new to wilderness fire or new to long-term fire management, having someone who has those skills there for the first couple of fires was said to be really helpful because it kind of allows you to bounce ideas off of, get feedback on what you're doing. It makes those first couple of rodeos a little bit less scary. And this idea of transfer of knowledge is really interesting because right now someone can work on a forest for 20 years and gain all of that local knowledge in terms of how fire behaves in this particular area. And then when they retire or move to a new district, just walk away, and none of that is transferred on to whoever is taking their position. So if there was some way to kind of make that transfer of knowledge easier, it could really make management of wilderness fire easier on that district. And this idea of investment in the wilderness program gets back to this idea that wilderness fire inherently involves wilderness. So we can't just rely on the fire folks to put in place wilderness fire. You also have to involve your wilderness rangers. And I know that's been done a lot in the Spotted Bear Ranger District, where there's training in basically getting their wilderness rangers a red card, so that when a fire occurs and they want to use it and they want to manage it for long-term use, they have resources available on the district even when resources are scarce nationally. And training can also include that ecological training. So if they have an understanding of why fire is important ecologically and why the wilderness fire program is so important, that can be communicated to all the public users that those wilderness rangers come in contact with. So it's also a way of spreading that information to the public. And finally, this idea of transparency with the public. So we talked about it in our breakout session a little bit, but we need to be communicating why this program is important before, during, and after a fire. So before and after, what are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? And during a fire, what is our plan and what are the potential risks? So just to kind of summarize it all overall, what kind of has emerged from the interviews and what I would be curious on getting feedback from you guys on is just this two-pronged approach at the regional and national level at which there's kind of a shift in the policy and how we think and talk about wilderness fire. And then at the local level, kind of a shift in how we train and allow our local managers to talk about wilderness fire. And I do want to kind of recognize, what I propose here is kind of in a perfect world, and there are budget limitations. But going back to how I started this talk, there are what benefits wilderness fire and what allows the wilderness fire to continue to grow can ultimately also benefit non-wilderness fire, and that we learn those long-term management strategies, We treat acres at a very low cost. So there's a potential, incentive there to talk about wilderness fire in a way that's not just kind of untangible and pie in the sky. So with that, I'd like to thank my advisor, Andrew Larson. He couldn't be here today because he's up floating the Yukon, but he wishes I think he preferred to be floating, but otherwise. And then also Carol, she's also been an advisor on this project, and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute is funding the project. And then all my interview subjects, I think I'm at like 22 now, and some folks have sat down with me for like 2 hours, so I'm really thankful for that. I don't know if I have any time for questions.
You do. You have time for a question or two, or if something that she said really struck you and you want to provide fodder for further discussion.
I do think we have some of those things in place, and would like to share more of that. For instance, we do have a framework within the wilderness program for promoting wilderness fire. I think sometimes the connection between the fire shop isn't as strong as it could be, and the funding connection isn't there, but there's been a lot of thought put into how do we frame fire in wilderness, and I could share some information on that.
That'd be great.
I just got one thing. That was all super good, but one thing I still struggle with, and I don't know if we got to get over that, is what are we going to call it, or what do we call these fires? We can't even ourselves can't come up with, the resource benefit fire, let it burn, all these different things that keep coming about. And I think that's one of the things that's burning us with the public and a lot of these other people and, stakeholders we talk to is we don't do a very good job of that. And even me as an FMO, sometimes I don't, we're going to manage it for resource benefits, a suppression fire, but we're not going to suppress it, but we're managing it for other objectives. I think we need to come up with a better terminology from somewhere up here of what we're going to actually do, I guess. Huh?
I'm looking at Frankie.
Yeah, Frankie can tell us what we're going to do. It seems like we struggle with that every year, every couple of years of what.
The next thing folks will say is quit changing the policy. And so that's kind of the dynamic we're in right now. The rock and the hard place is we have had a lot of change for a while. That Pole Creek FLA that I talked about earlier, that'd be a good read for folks. I think one of the key recommendations that came out of that was always be able to express what your control strategy is going to be and talk to that. It's a wildfire, and here's how we intend to provide for safety, security, and react to whatever movement it's going to do. So that was one of the key messages that the mistake they, in retrospect, said all we did was said we're monitoring this fire. It's in a place where we prefer fire. And then when it did something, then people got rattled. And so that was one of the, I would refer folks to that recent FLA for a little talk about always have in mind right up front, here's what we intend to do. So.
Well, in response to that, obviously you have to lead with that, but here's what we're going to do to make sure you're safe or make sure your community's safe. But inherent in saying that is fire is bad. Can you not find a way to yes and that and say, we're going to make sure you're safe, but there is a benefit for this fire on the land, and that we can find, and some of that is maybe galvanizing around what we're going to call it, how we're going to talk about why it's of value, not only to the place, but to the people that benefit from that place, not just for recreation reasons, all those sort of things. I feel like if it's always just, here's how we're going to minimize your risk, we're continuing Smokey Bear and fire is terrible, fire is bad, we're going to keep you away from it.